I'm calling the first segment of this live streaming episode How to Defeat Those Corrupt Judges Who Are Helping Trump Run Out the Clock. Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler, the host of these Man on a Mission live streams. And the mission I'm on, you can tell from almost any of my videos, but most especially on my website, betterhumanstory.org, where I claim to be able to show some things that put important questions in a different light that could help us with the effort to make American democracy survive into the future, but even larger to I claim to help human civilization survive, where I think we have a real chance of destroying ourselves. So this is all part of a big picture, and I'll just quickly get to our subject by saying I am going to assume that you know that we're in a major battle here in America over whether American democracy is going to survive or whether it'll be overthrown by a lawless force of fascism. And I'm going to assume that you know that a big part of that larger battle is being waged between the most criminal president by orders of magnitude we've ever had in this country in over two centuries, whether he's going to be able to overthrow the rule of law by evading the forces of justice and becoming president in the next election, and then sweeping away all the ways in which the American force of justice, you might say, Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, and others have been indicting him for the most serious crimes in American history. Trump has no legal defense, and so his two strategies have nothing to do with proving his innocence. It's lying to his base for political purposes, and it's delaying in every way that he can the trials that will expose him for what he is, which is basically a man with no respect whatsoever for the rule of law or the Constitution, who has not hesitated to violate his oath of office, and who now pretty openly talks about a second Trump presidency in which the face of fascism gets uncovered in much of its traditional ugliness. So he's been waging a battle in court, through the courts, to delay everything. I mean, that's all of his arguments, virtually all, I can't think of an exception offhand, are quite bogus. And certainly the case that the Supreme Court decided to, for no good reason whatsoever, to hear and to keep slow walking, the Supreme Court has last week delayed the case to such an extent that while it is still possible that this trial would take place before the election, I can't see really it's a theoretical possibility. Somebody on TV said, they're going to hear the case on April 22nd. They should hand down a decision on April 23rd, and then things can get moving along. And Judge Chuck can do this, and Jack Smith can do that, and we can have a trial and a verdict before the election. But if they had wanted that, there was no need for them to take the case at all. And if they wanted to take the case, they could have taken it back in December when Jack Smith said, we have a huge public interest in getting this case resolved. So what we have with their decision is they took a case that really should be fast tracked to get the trial conducted, because the citizens have a right to know whether this guy is the criminal that has been charged with all these indictments. Again, some of them for crimes that are hard to imagine what would be more serious than overthrowing American democracy. A huge public interest. And the Supreme Court has shown that it knows how to do things fast when it needs to. It did it in the Nixon case with the tapes. The special prosecutor back in '74 wanted the Supreme Court to fast track this, to skip the appeals level and take it directly up to the Supreme Court, which heard the case very quickly, decided the case very quickly, and that led to Richard Nixon's resignation. It knows how to do it, but this court has refused to do it. No good reason whatsoever, because I haven't heard a single legal scholar, and I must have heard a dozen talk about this, who says there's any merit whatsoever to Trump's appeal. But Trump's various appeals are so unappealing, it's hard to call them appeals. Their purpose is not to make any legal argument. It's just to delay. And the court, the Supreme Court, and we don't know, I mean, I'm not saying that everybody on the court was willing to do this, though it's discouraging that they unanimously decided that the 14th Amendment doesn't bar him. But that's another story. We saw that coming. But I didn't see it coming last week, that the court was going to do this thing, which is so nakedly partisan. It really exposes a serious problem we have with this Supreme Court. It is no longer, it is the opposite of what a court's supposed to be. A court's supposed to adjudicate on the basis of law and constitution and justice between conflicting parties. But this court is an extension of one of the major political forces at work in America today. And it isn't just any old political force. It's really the political force of fascism. And the Supreme Court this week has come in, or last week, come in and said, we're going to deal with this case in a way that will make it impossible. I think they're not going to hand down a decision on April 23rd. It'll probably be the end of June by the time they hand down a decision. And maybe it'll be too late. Now, I did hear a legal expert that I respect very much last night saying, oh, no, it's a political friend of mine, saying he was confident that the case could be heard. But people like Weissman and Katyal, who are very, very good, they talk about how it could be done, but they neglect to take into account all the evidence that the court is intentionally helping Trump delay the whole process of justice. My interpretation of why they do this is that they are basically an extension of not just the Republican Party, but of the force behind the Republican Party. And what they do on issue after issue is really to be interpreted that way, whether it's Citizens United, which opened the floodgates to the money power, or whether it's Shelby, where the Voting Rights Act was gutted so that they could, the states of the former Confederacy could resume the old practice of disenfranchising black people who actually tend to vote Democratic. So it's just, doing the Republicans' business. And similarly with Heller decision on guns. But on this decision, it's just so, you don't even have to look for an opinion because there isn't any opinion. And it shows that even though at some levels the forces of the rule of law are doing a really good job I mean, Merrick Garland should have done this right away instead of waiting 2 years. That's not corruption. That's a kind of cowardice, I'm afraid. Decent man, but chicken. But beyond that, it is the force of fascism that has taken possession of some important territory in the domain of the American justice system. There's that judge down in Florida that's been just grotesque in the way that she's an extension of Trump's interest, which means that she's an extension of the fascist interest, which means that she is allied with with the man who appointed her to that bench. I've never seen, and she's been smacked down by conservative appeals court, and I just keep on hoping she'll be swept off of the case, but I'm not sure how much chance of that. And now we got the Supreme Court that whose conduct about this worthless presidential immunity claim that Trump has, which, there's just it is contrary to everything about the American system to imagine that the president can do whatever he damn pleases, no matter what crimes he might commit, that nobody can ever prosecute him. It's just not the American system, where nobody's above the law. Chutkan destroyed it with her decision. The D.C. Court of Appeals just devastated it. The Supreme Court decided that they're going to be on the side of the criminal and not the rule of law. And one of the things that tells us, and this is sort of another subject, but I just sent in my weekly op-ed piece about America's serious problem with the Supreme Court. That this shows us that this court is territory which has been captured by the force of fascism. It's not just partisan, it's partisan for a force which is exceptionally dark and destructive and contrary to the basic American values. So we've got that problem that America really needs to confront. But the immediate problem is really Donald Trump. And in particular, it's got to do with what's going to happen at the ballot box come this fall, where there is enough. I actually am optimistic, but I am so worried underneath my optimism. I've got my way of seeing how this is going to play out, and the American people are going to reject this fascist force. But there are poll numbers that indicate that I got to be right about several things which aren't yet played out to have a basis for my optimism. So we've got a showdown coming up, and these court cases are relevant to it. The exit polls, when Republicans go voting in these presidential primaries, the exit polls show that there's a fairly substantial number of Republican voters in the primaries who say, and we don't know how much they're to be believed, they say they wouldn't vote for Trump if he were convicted. So that would give a partisan court that's an extension of and a part of the fascist power behind what the Republican Party has become over the last generation, an incentive to prevent Trump from having to have his serious crimes systematically exposed in a court of law. We know that Jack Smith, we've seen filing documents enough to know he and his team are really, if this isn't an anachronism to use the expression, crackerjack. I don't know, are there still Cracker Jacks in this country? I remember as a kid I loved them, but crackerjack means really good. Really good, super competent, and had the Supreme Court done what it should have done, we would be beginning today with jury selection, leading to a trial pretty soon in which Jack Smith and his team would just lay out in vivid detail, incontrovertible testimony, largely from people who were a part of Trump's orbit, a picture of this human monster whose conduct is just almost beyond belief, and how morally dark and ugly it is. I mean, he's a man who's a liar, a cheater, a bully, a fraud, who cares only about himself. Even in the face of a pandemic, he cared only about how it was going to play for him. I don't think the American people are going to go for that. And I feel somewhat confident. But it would be nice if it's true that a verdict in a trial like this would get at least a substantial number of those Republican voters who say they wouldn't vote for Trump to actually do what they say they would do. I'd like for this 2024 election to be a huge blowout. I would like it to be a death blow, not only to Trump's cult, but to the whole Republican Party, whose moral bankruptcy has enabled it to become a place where, if anybody's got any integrity, like Liz Cheney, that's a basis for kicking them out. I'd like to see that party. And I have respect for the Republican Party I grew up with. This ain't it. It hasn't been it for quite a while. I ran for Congress out here in 2012 on the slogan "Truth for a Change." And the highlight of my campaign was a speech that went viral. You can find it out there under Schmuckler and Labor Day. I said that this was a time when truth-telling needed its champions. And this was a Republican Party that was not our father's Republican Party, and that got a big response. You know, we've watched something get transformed right in front of our eyes. Liberal America has been too slow, almost incomprehensibly slow, to recognize over the last 30 years the Republican Party, even of the first Bush administration or Reagan, let alone some of the more noble times. This party had become something really much different. It wasn't politics as usual anymore, and it has led to this battle between democracy and fascism, between the rule of law and the success of a lawless person, that the Supreme Court has just given a huge boost in his continuing effort to defeat the rule of law, which is trying to hold him accountable. I'm not going to assume, but I'm going to bet that you are a person who's felt frustration and pain at how much it seems that Donald Trump has been able to get away with. And that's part of this battle. It's part of the battle that the Supreme Court did about helping him with his delay. And it is part of the larger battle of democracy versus fascism, which, because if Donald Trump wins this presidential election, it's not unreasonable to fear that will represent the loss of our democracy to an extent and in ways that won't necessarily be easily regained. Oftentimes we can think, 4 years from now, we'll have another chance. This is a force that's willing to break all the rules, and not just Trump, but the Republican Party generally is willing to break all the rules to increase and consolidate its power. So if it gets a Trump presidency, and if Trump gets the presidency and the Republican Party is working with him on our system, it might be one of those things where people lose ground that it takes a very long time to regain. In 1917, a revolution called the Kerensky Revolution came to power, having overthrown the Tsarist regime. I mean, the Russians had hankered for freedom at various intervals in their history, and had always somehow failed to bring off. But it looked in early 1917 like this Kerensky regime might get Russia on the path toward being a decent European society where the people have some voice or whatever. I'm no expert on the Kerensky regime, I'll confess, but by October or November, I think it's October, the Bolsheviks, which is to say the communists, led by Lenin, overthrew the Kerensky regime, and a communist tyranny got set up. There was a civil war, but the Lenin regime survived. And then when Lenin died, not that much later, it's not like Russia got freer. And it came under the force of a real human monster, Stalin. And that was a huge nightmare from 1927? He died in 53 or so. And what terrible things they went through. We Americans have never been subject to such a thing as the Stalin terror. But, I think of the song, I never promised you a rose garden. To paraphrase Ben Franklin, we have a rose garden, so as long as we can keep it, and we got a showdown coming. So how do we, I think that these judges, which show such a corrupt intent that places them on the side opposite of the Constitution that the Supreme Court is supposed to be the final defender of. And there is that battle. But at the moment, the battle is to make sure that Trump loses. And if that verdict that the Supreme Court may prevent people from ever hearing before they have to vote, if a verdict is actually required to get those Republicans to vote, not for Trump because he is guilty of crimes, what we need to do is to find another way of convincing those people, in the absence of the court process, that they've got the equivalent of a verdict. It's a "he's guilty!" exclamation point campaign. And there's nothing whatsoever irresponsible about telling the American people, without having to have Jack Smith conduct a trial, that he's guilty, because we know it. We know it beyond any reasonable doubt. Now, the public needs to understand why that is completely justified. And there are 2 points I would make about that. First of all, people might think, but fallaciously, that we owe Trump the presumption of innocence. In America, no one is guilty. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty. That is a narrow concept. It should not be interpreted broadly. It is a narrow concept that is confined to what is the duty of the jury in a trial. It is their duty to wipe their minds clean as the trial begins, to listen to all the evidence that's presented by both sides, by examination and cross-examination, by the prosecutor's case and the defense's case. We have a system of justice which says when we are going to maybe send somebody to jail, deprive them of their liberty, that can only be done by getting a jury of the defendant's peers to agree unanimously that the case has been proved right in front of them according to the rules of law. I think that's really beautiful. I hate to think of all the human history that underlies our founders having come up with all this, and not just the guys who wrote the Constitution, but the whole tradition that got set up about justice. It's really quite marvelous. Well, we as citizens are not jurors. We not only are not obliged to give him the presumption of innocence until a trial has been conducted and a verdict has been reached. We are actually obligated to draw conclusions based on whatever it is we know. As citizens, we're supposed to pay attention to whatever the reality is. Is there climate change? Well, we're supposed to pay attention to know what the answer to that question is. Is there racial inequality as a systemic problem in America and in American history? We're supposed to be informed enough to know that there's a reason why there might be a Black Lives Matter movement. Oh, the list could go on and on. We're supposed to know things, and we've set up a government that is going to be constituted by how people vote, and they're going to vote on the basis of whatever it is they know. It can be whatever proportion of knowledge and ignorance they happen to bring to it, but they got to draw the best conclusions they can and vote. That's what the system's based on. As citizens, our obligation is to judge. For example, if the question is Trump guilty of having committed these crimes for which he's been indicted, if that question is one that citizens should answer, and clearly it is, when our whole constitutional system is on the line, clearly, on more than on policy matters, this is the most fundamental question, democracy versus fascism. And if people are going to be ready to vote for democracy and against fascism based on some kind of conclusion about the guilt of the accused, we definitely have an obligation to draw a conclusion. And we've got the means to do it. I mean, I've been paying a lot of attention to this stuff, and I know so many times more of what I need to know to be able to draw a conclusion that I feel quite comfortable making. And I grew up in a family culture where you don't jump to conclusions, and where you recognize what you don't know. But I do know. I know beyond a reasonable doubt. And so should every American citizen that's got decent intelligence and is paying a decent amount of attention to what's been presented publicly, not only in this January 6th case, the election overturning case, the coup d'etat case, that the Supreme Court has just helped protect Trump from. But more generally, we know a huge amount about the Mar-a-Lago stolen documents, national security compromising espionage case. I mean, we know that he defied subpoenas. We just, I mean, I don't know whether Jack Smith would have any surprises in either of those trials. And I'm sure he would present it really systematically. It would be a thing of beauty. But all the information we need and more is available already. That's been reported reliably in the news. We've seen things, including Jack Smith laying out in all these cases is it called a bill of indictment? And a filing which describes in dozens and dozens of pages exactly what he's being charged with and the nature of the evidence that shows him to be guilty. So we got that. Those things could be read or paraphrased or whatever. But what I'm saying, what I'm getting to about how to defeat these corrupt judges is that if we apply our intelligence and our moral passion to the task of communicating to those people who should have been able to see the trial, whatever is going to convince them that Trump is guilty, a verdict of the public. Now, I'm somewhat concerned about anybody who doesn't already know that Trump is guilty, but I gather that a lot of people really don't pay much attention at all. So maybe it actually is necessary to show them. I'm assuming that it is, though I also fear that, they're saying that, a verdict is important and they wouldn't vote for Trump. Can I trust that? I don't know, but we got to go for it anyway, because we are fighting to save our democracy and because his guilt can be shown. There's abundant evidence. There are all kinds of ways of doing things. I'm not claiming that I know exactly what this campaign would look like, but I feel confident that if we got all the right people engaged in this campaign, and people come to my mind like Adam Schiff, Jamie Raskin, this conservative judge, if he'd be willing to set aside his lifelong membership in the impeccable judiciary tradition, and recognize that if he wants to be the champion of the rule of law, he should put his shoulder to this wheel. There's all kinds of people and advertisements and a multimedia kind of campaign can be launched to do whatever it is that's possible to inform the American electorate, as well as should have happened through the trial that the corrupt Republican appointed judges seem to be determined to prevent the American people from witnessing before the election. It is an idea that there should be a campaign. It isn't any attempt to prejudge what different people's creativity might put out into that campaign. But the evidence is there. And that is one of the main battlefields, apparently. Will the American people recognize who this guy is? Because my optimism is based on the belief that at least that 2/3 of Americans, if they understood that voting for Republicans, or including Trump these days, represents voting against the survival of American democracy and voting for fascism. I think that 2/3 of the American people would vote for democracy, and maybe 3/4. We could have an electoral blowout, and I was really hungry for this exposure in the trials to take place. We already did get the American people exposed to a brilliant presentation. The January 6th committee, in a sense, conducted a kind of trial. It was a legitimate process. I mean, it didn't have defense attorneys and all that, but it exposed a case which led to the criminal referral that probably led Garland to finally overcome his cowardice and appoint a special prosecutor. We can do this. Now is the time for all good people to come to the aid of their country. And a lot of people could step forward, and there is such creative energy in America that I can imagine being put to such use. I recently saw, the first time I ever saw the Grammys, and they've made it such a brilliant production. I mean, all the creativity that goes into that, and then that Never Trumper movement of former Republicans have done some brilliant ads. I don't see why we can't launch such a campaign to substitute for the trial, to defeat the move of the corrupt judges in Florida and in the Supreme Court, to defeat them with such a campaign. And one little thing that in addition to the data, that all the evidence that can be brought forward to show the American people, yeah, he's guilty. He's guilty. That's the campaign. He's guilty. We know he's guilty. In addition to that, one little move I would make is to say, besides sweeping aside that presumption of innocence fallacy, take a look at the delay. What the judges are, what they did is basically to give Trump's efforts to delay everything, which is, you can just show delay. Every time everything gets appealed, the arguments are bogus, but he wins anyway. He loses everything he tries, but he wins everything that delays. And I think that the American people would, it would help to convince American people to point out, now, if you were innocent, would you want to delay a chance to prove your innocence? You've been accused of these terrible crimes, and you're saying it's politically motivated, and you've done nothing wrong. Wouldn't you want to get that trial underway where you can just sort of blow the prosecution's case out of the water? Sure you would. But that's not what Trump wants. He wants to avoid having the American people exposed to the facts. And everything he does is intended to prevent people maybe from ever seeing the facts. If he becomes president and can kill the cases, and democracy would already be dead, along with the rule of law. Trump's tactics in delaying are a virtual confession, and I think that case can be made. Okay, that's the first segment of this live stream. As a man on a mission, my mission ultimately is to try to get some thoughtful and intelligent people who would care to understand what's going on in the human world, to take a look at essentially, I'll say, my life's work, which I call A Better Human Story, which I claim puts some important matters in a wholly different light. I mean, part of the mission's got to do with American democracy, and I've spent the last 20 years trying to show what the political battle in America is about. And this democracy versus fascism thing is something I began writing about in 2004 and really got into in 2005. And here it is, and now it's visible. So I did have a mission back then, when it seemed like liberal America was not looking at what was happening, at the nature of the force that had taken over the Republican Party. And I felt that, awakening liberal America to the transformation that had taken place in the Republican Party and the implications that had for how the battle between Democrats and Republicans at the ballot box was changing its meaning. It was changing from will there be a conservative approach to steering our way into an American democratic future, or will there be a liberal way in which, which set of values is going to predominate? But we had a basic American consensus, and we argued over policy. But that was changing, and my life's work had been about sort of discerning the forces at work in the human world. And I saw back in the early 90s, and then in spades back in 2004, that the battle was changing in nature. And I began trying to say that there's a very fundamental difference now between the political force that's aligned on the left and the political force that's taken over the right. A fundamental battle such that, now we talk about I'm talking about in terms of democracy and fascism, because it's right clear in front of our eyes right now. But that business about that conflict is actually tied into what has been my lifelong message, which has been about really understanding some important things that are not part of the current worldview about what happened to our species when we stepped onto the path of civilization. The whole meaning of our becoming this unprecedented thing, the civilization creating animal. The whole meaning of taking an unprecedented step out of the natural order has not been examined, but something, I saw something back in 1970, which changed the course of my life. And so I've got this mission to put it out because I think it puts some things into an importantly different light. It shows that step puts us into an unprecedented situation. That situation has an unprecedented systemic dynamic. That unprecedented systemic dynamic unleashes a force of destruction, inevitably. And to leap over that a little bit, to make a connection, the best, if one were looking at how destructive forces and forces of that are life-serving conflict in the human world, and you can see, if you see those forces in operation, you're more likely to see that sometimes there emerges in a historical arena a kind of dichotomy between forces that are embattled in the arena of power. That's what's happened in America in our times. We've come to a point where something that nobody back in Reagan's America could have ever imagined could be a major American party. It is, kind of quite consistently on the wrong side of everything it says and does. I mean, can you think of a single place where, because of what the Republicans did or said, things move in a better direction rather than worse? I can't. I used to be able to find a few, but the transformation now seems to be complete. What we have in America today in this battle between democracy and fascism is a version of a drama that's at the center of the human story that was an inevitable outcome. And I claim that I can show that. It's not easy to show, like a bumper sticker's worth, but I claim I can show that that's true because of an analyzing in that book back there, the Parable of the Tribes, the problem of power and social evolution, basically shows that it's really an inescapable conclusion that the step onto the path of civilization inevitably unleashes a destructive force. And it's been a very powerful destructive force, powerful in particular in determining how civilization evolves. I mean, I show that there's a selective process, and I use that in a kind of a Darwinian way, but it's not in a biologically governed system. A selective process inevitably emerges that the subtitle of that is The Problem of Power and Social Evolution. And what we're dealing with in America today is a version of that problem of power. Donald Trump, and backed by this Republican base, and that's a whole nother subject, and having intimidated the whole Republican Party into being his vassals, he represents something that is consistently working to make the human world worse. And the battle between that and the rule of law has that destructive force arrayed against the way of controlling power that is the best human beings have been able to come up with. I'm not saying our Constitution is perfect or anything like that, but the rule of law as a concept is so much better than what civilization inevitably emerges with, which is wherever it shows up to begin with, you end up with tyrannical empires and masses of enslaved people who are living lives much worse than hunter-gatherers had lived. Some anthropologist that I quoted, I haven't thought of this quote in years, said that no hunting-gathering people had ever gone to civilization, I don't remember how he put it, as a choice to something better. The civilization hasn't been under control because we have extricated, we're the creatures that took what turned out to be a very fateful step. And I want you to check out to see whether I can show that this is an inevitability. I claim that I can. A fateful step of extricating ourselves from the niche in which we've evolved biologically by inventing our own way of life. And there's no, one step movement from that fact, from the force that gets unleashed, which I describe as one which makes it inevitable that the spirit of the gangster will have a disproportionate say in how civilization evolves. Well, the spirit of the gangster is like what we got here in America right now that seems to have a chance to become president again. I mean, everybody's talked for years about how he behaves like a mob boss. He's a thug. Hey, it's not coincidental that when he talked about NATO, he made it sound like a protection racket. Yeah, we'll protect you if you pay us up with the money. Otherwise, we'll something. It would be a shame if something happened to this nice little democracy you got. What a what a terrible person. There's a part of me which actually wonders how much do we actually need the trials? I mean, I want the trials. I want them bad. I loved what the January 6th committee did, and we did see the needle move. The trials are going to show something that everybody should already know, but I don't know what happens in people's minds. Either they're not paying attention or they know, but it's not convenient to hold that knowledge in place because, I don't know what the reason is. Because Biden's old? I don't know. I mean, I can't say that I understand, but people did move when the January 6th committee, I mean, 5%, maybe 6, moved in the polls when Trump's criminality was exposed. Yeah. The rule of law has to win this battle one way or the other. It would be nice if we could win it in court, but we got to win it at the ballot box. And it's just the latest way in which the force of brokenness that emerged into the civilized world has worked its way. And I encourage you to see whether I actually, what I've done. I mean, I'm an obsessive guy that's been building this thing for a long, long time. And I think one of the things I claim to show, and you can see this also in one of my videos, I claim to show that a couple of things that are not part of the secular worldview now, but they can be shown to be true, is that the step onto the path of civilization leads by a series of inevitable steps to there being at the center of that creature's drama a battle between two coherent forces. Now, I have a phrasing of these forces, and then I'm going to encourage you to think about how it's appropriate, if there were such forces, it would be appropriate to think of them as good and evil. Not you can give it other names, but the secular worldview has been of a mind that the difference between good and evil is just a matter of opinion. The difference between America as Biden presides over it and America as Trump did and would preside over it, it is not just a matter of opinion. And I've developed from an evolutionary perspective how the domains of value and of spiritually transformative experience, the evolution has put those things in us, and it proves them to be life-serving. And that the secular worldview makes a significant error in not recognizing that these dimensions are valid in the only way that anything like value or spiritual truth could be valid. There are some flaws in the main thinking of the secular worldview, which can be overcome by looking at our nature in an evolutionary perspective. But first, the evolutionary perspective shows something different, which has got to do with the huge consequences, the inevitable consequences, the regrettable consequences of a creature extricating itself from an order in which because of natural selection and the processes of the life and developing on Earth, in which the interactions among the various actors have been selected for increasing the synergy and the viability of the whole. It's a perpetual motion machine life tends to create. That's the order in which we developed and emerged. And it is an order because it's always choosing what can survive over what cannot survive, what can get its DNA into the future over what cannot. It's always creating stuff that is in an overarching way life-serving, but we broke out of it. And I believe that what can be shown to be true, like that I sincerely cannot see how there's any hole in it that really jeopardizes the overall conclusions, and that these conclusions have very important implications. I truly believe all that, which is why I'm a man on a mission. And among the conclusions that I believe that can be shown is that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. I mean, think of this, for example. Let's look at I'm not using the word fascism in a really strict, narrow set of definitions, whatever. I mean, I've studied that stuff. I wouldn't want to be tested on it right now, but I'm sort of using that word because I think of all the words that are available to us right now. It helps capture something of what the essence of it is, so that we'll grok it if that word still has any cultural. That's from Strangers in a Strange Land by Heinlein. It's got to do with understanding something in a deep level. Fascism, I think, captures a variety of realities that we see in the human world around us right now. I mean, it's very painful to look at the human world around us right now. Take, for example, look at Russia. It's got this fascist dictator. I, for one, felt that almost as wonderful as this Cold War ending without our blowing ourselves up was, I also felt warm deep in my heart at the thought back in the 90s that maybe Russia would finally be on the path to democracy. These people have had such a hard history. You know, I talked about Stalin back a little while ago, but it is a country in which there has been a lot of oppression. And they've got people like Ivan the Terrible. I mean, they've had their share of monsters. And I really like the idea that that Russia might become something that the best of the Russians have envisioned. You know, people like Navalny. I mean, I don't know exactly what his Russia might have been like if it was if Putin hadn't made himself into such an absolute ruler that there was never any chance that Navalny would win a presidential election, no matter how he ran or what the Russian people wanted. But anyway, it's a very ugly place where they murder their opponents, where they have bogus elections, and where one man with kind of crazy dreams that are fueled by his lust for power, you know, like a good fascist dictator is likely to have, as happened in 1939, invades his neighbor. And think of how much ugliness there is in the world, like in Europe right now. Europe was in the process of creating a kind of a European order that had a lot of beauty to it. I mean, the EU, NATO, and democratic norms, which they don't enforce as strictly as I'd like them to, like in Hungary. But another question altogether. But nonetheless, in the out of the rubble of World War II, a lot of really good people did a lot of wonderful work to create a European order in which, just for starters, France and Germany were, in a sense, close friends, where 3 times in the course of 60 some years, the Germans had overrun the French in a brutal war. Well, particularly World Wars I and II. The War of 1871 was no picnic. But they became friends. Look what fascism has done. Not that it split up France and Germany. That's not my point. It's taken this peaceful order of Europe, worked so hard to create, and change the whole disposition of the place. Where we got Macron last week talking about, well, maybe NATO troops should be put on the ground in Ukraine. And the only reason he's talking that way, I'm guessing, is what fascism is doing right here in America by blocking the aid to the Ukraine. So what he's done to Europe, I said that the ugliness we see in the human world is not human nature writ large. The force of evil, the force of fascism, the force of brokenness that's all involved in what Russia has become and what this one-man government is doing to his people and sending his troops by the tens of thousands into a meat grinder, committing war crimes on another country and genocide. That has changed the world into such directions of brokenness. That's not what humanity wanted. That's not what Europe wanted. It shows the ability of, in a disordered system, in an archaic inter-societal system where a big power like Russia can invade a medium power like Ukraine, it has taken that disorder and that opened the door for a force of brokenness, for fascism, to spread the pattern of brokenness into the human world. That's not human nature. If there had been a majority vote on the continent, they would have kept on going in the direction of that Europe had gone, a zone of peace, where the relationships between nations are more or less cordial, where they form some kind of a collective parliament, and where an attack on one would be an attack on all. And he's made the disorder in the system that allows Putin to invade Ukraine makes the human world much uglier than we human beings are. People forever have, looked around the human world and they've seen such brokenness. I mean, read the Bible. And I'm not a believer in the Bible, but what a wonderful trove of all kinds of stuff it is, including history, including a portrait of a world that existed in a state of certain kinds of disorder where, the Hebrews might be slaves for 400 years. Where a greater power might come in and trash and it's the word, when you trample on what other people consider sacred. All kinds of ugliness there. Well, that's what you get with disorder. So one of the conclusions of my Better Human Story book is that the central challenge facing humankind, which I would incidentally say I can pretty well demonstrate would face any creature that and on any planet that stepped across onto the path of civilization, is to bring this destructive force under control, which is to say, to order its civilization well enough and soon enough to prevent self-destruction. I haven't even talked today here about self-destruction, but that's in the background here. So long as we've got, massive nuclear arsenals here and there in the world, and so long as we've got a civilization that is so ordered that something like a human monster like Vladimir Putin can be in presumed control of a massive nuclear arsenal and can invade unprovoked a neighboring country, self-destruction cannot be ruled out. And in fact, what I always say is that my gut feeling is it's a toss-up which way it's going to go. Because it's a toss-up, I feel like if getting my life's work out there would have some impact, clarifying what our task is, including in terms of defeating Donald Trump, but also in a larger sense about how we got to create a system of civilization in which something like a nuclear holocaust is not a possibility, or at least in which that possibility has been made as minimal as it possibly can, given that some genies can't be put back into some bottles. So we have a challenge that operates at a lot of levels, but they are all part of the same basic struggle between life and death. Is human civilization going to get its act together? Getting things together is the path of life in order to survive on this planet for the long haul, or are we going to destroy ourselves? A nuclear holocaust, or by dismantling the biosphere that we depend upon for our survival as well. That is the basic question, and all these other battles are part of that basic battle, both in the sense that, let's say when we see the fascistic force of Trump in the Supreme Court trying to guide this human monster and one-man crime spree out of the grasp of the system of justice, or whether that system of justice will be able to bring him to justice. That is one of the specific battles that is part of the battle between the rule of law and lawlessness, and democracy and fascism, and that which serves life and that which degrades it. And then you really can make a legitimate move from that level to, it's all part of a battle between two forces that you can see working in the world, that sometimes you can see rather clearly, like in our current political battle, that equate to the battle between good and evil. Now, I believe that I can show that the force of brokenness and the force of wholeness are sort of marbled through the whole human world most of the time. Spread, like fat in a good chuck roast or something like that. But oftentimes it's, all the various actors are have components of brokenness that are operating in them. Their neuroses, their trauma, whatever, and they've got their virtues, what's psychologically healthy in them, their compassion, and they're always operating, in each of us. Which of the various parts of us, what's broken and what's whole, are going to govern us in the decisions we make throughout our lives. Or even at the level of political parties. You've got the Republican Party of Eisenhower and the Democratic Party of, say, Stevenson, who ran against him and lost in 52 and 56. And you could look at both of them, and you could look at both of them, and you could see that both of those parties had virtues and brokenness. The brokenness in Eisenhower's party, well, it included, but wasn't limited to, that it was too willing to serve the people who had the most power and wealth. When, as the Bible says, as the good book says, you don't take from the poor to give to the rich, but the Republican Party has always had that tendency. The Democratic Party was a mixture too. It had its clear virtues, and certainly Adlai Stevenson was a fine man, as was Eisenhower. But the coalition behind him included the Solid South, which was essentially the heir to the force of the slave power, and still Jim Crowing into the world of segregation and the fascistic fiction of separate being equal. But we have arrived right now in a time when the battle between the fascists, I won't just say the Democratic Party, but that is the power-seeking arm of the coalition, of the pro-democracy coalition, that they are fighting for basically for everything that's good. When it comes to climate change, it's the difference between the people who are trying to get us to behave responsibly and the people who are willing to sacrifice huge amount of well-being for our grandchildren and the biosphere in order to feed the short-term profits of the plutocracy, specifically the fossil fuel industry. We've got, with respect to democracy, we got the party that's disenfranchising people and the people who are trying to protect the right to vote. On the rule of law, we've got the people who are trying to see to it that we live up to our credo that no one is above the law, versus the people who are backing the guy who is doing everything he can to defy and attack the rule of law. Not only defying and lying to law authorities down in Florida, defying subpoenas, but threatening judges. And I mean, he's making a multi-pronged war against the rule of law. We've already seen that maps really quite well about human well-being and thriving versus suffering, justice versus injustice. We've gotten ourselves into a historic situation that really calls to be perceived in these binary terms. It really calls to be seen as a manifestation of a long social evolutionary dynamic in which a force that's trying to make the human world better, that comes from within us, that has its foundation within us, the world as we want it to be, is engaged in a battle at the center of the human drama against a force of brokenness that is consistently working to make the human world worse. So if we launch a campaign to counteract the move the Supreme Court just made, they said, we're going to help Trump keep the American people from seeing that he's guilty. We can counteract that by saying, no, trial or no trial, we can help those Americans who might have learned from the trial to see that he is guilty. And we can gain the territory that the Supreme Court was trying to help Trump take away from the forces of the rule of law, and help to defeat Trump in the battlefield that is part of a huge picture that inevitably emerged when we became the civilization creating creatures. Now, I actually do believe, and this is why I'm on a mission as I approach my 78th birthday and would just as soon not be driven. I truly do believe that if people would actually check out whether some of these things I claim to show or demonstrate, and I'm even tempted to say prove, are true, that people would, like, subscribe here, please, and that would be nice. As a writer, I really feel driven to driven again. I should do my own driving. I want to invite you to go to a betterhumanstory.org, where I've applied the craft I've spent 60 years trying to learn how to do effectively, laying things out in a way which I think you'll find persuasive on all these questions. I mean, they're not off the top of my head. But I actually think that this picture would change, not only help us to see the battlefield more accurately, understanding what we're up against. That's the name of that book back there, which is about our American crisis and about the play of forces in the human world, what we're up against, the destructive force at work in our world and how we can defeat it. I really think that we're going to be a lot more effective in fighting this thing the better we understand exactly what we're up against. And what we're up against in Trump is a force of fascism. And what we're up against in fascism is a destructive force that has been at the center of the human drama since we took that unprecedented step. And one of the ways I think it would be beneficial, when I say the ugliness we see in human history, is not human nature writ large. It is showing a systemic forces in unavoidable influence on how civilization develops. It is not showing the nature of the creature. It is not showing the nature of the creature, because any planet, any creature on any planet, anywhere on the cosmos that steps onto the path of civilization, I claim to show, would inevitably be driven into the same destructive social evolutionary force and would have to face the same challenge. Would they be able to bring that thing under control soon enough? Because they eventually will, if they don't, they're going to destroy themselves. It's sort of part of the destiny that's implied in taking a step whose significance becomes significant, becomes visible. If you look at it through an evolutionary perspective, that up until that point, life would have created them and a whole web of life across the planet. But it would never have created anything which was not shaped by an evolutionary process that mandated that it be compatible with the viability of the whole in the long term. I like to quote a line from, what's his name? He was really popular back in the late 60s and early 70s. He was married to the August 14th woman. Anyway, he said, no creature can win against its environment for long. We took ourselves out of an order. Any place that anybody starts inventing their own way of life, they're going to trip into a disorder. Can't help it. That's what it means to start creating a new way of life that hasn't been shaped over eons of time to fit into the larger system. I say the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they destroy each other. So one way we will be fortified so that the chances of our getting our act together will be increased is if we have a better sense of ourselves, if we see ourselves in a more positive way. I believe we are in this culture, and probably throughout history everywhere, positively burdened by the belief that when we look around the world and we see all this ugliness, we're seeing what we are. Oh, Europe is now this ugly thing again. And how about the Middle East? Maybe it's not entirely legit to apply the word fascism to what Hamas did, though I'm inclined to do so, because I think that in terms of what I think is the essence of the thing, what Hamas did on October 7th is an expression of the force that I'm calling fascism. And more clearly, the impetus of brokenness that Hamas put into the system with those atrocities got amplified by Israel being under the control of this fascistic leader, Netanyahu, and an even more fascistic Israeli coalition. It's not the nature of Israel writ large, I would say. I am a lover of Israel, having spent 6 weeks all over the country and recognizing its challenges and difficulties and all that. I think that something quite wonderful got created, and I also am very anti the political force in Israel that has been dealing with the challenge that they face trying to have a Jewish state in that part of the world, given both that it's embedded in an Arab Muslim situation and that they are now, since 1967, in control of a lot of territory that was not part of the original Jewish state that got created in 48 and whose existence was brought into existence, the only country in the history of the world brought into an existence by a vote of the whole world community. But they're in control of a lot of other people, and they also have as 20% of their population people who are religiously and ethnically tied to the people of the West Bank and Gaza and in refugee camps here, formerly at least, like in Lebanon. How to navigate out of the history of the creation of that state, its rejection by its neighbors, and its fight for survival, and the emergence in Israel of a force which I would describe as a force of brokenness. So that just like Putin in Europe, this Israeli coalition in Israel is the spirit of the gangster and not representative of human nature, Israeli nature, Russian nature writ large. We are all better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. If our culture teaches us something like the doctrine of original sin, and if the sense of sinfulness is so painfully deep that redemption from sin becomes the central spiritual issue in Western civilization's dominant religion, I can't but help but think that we need to believe in ourselves more than that. And I don't claim to prove, just how wonderful human nature is. It's a question I've been wrestling with at least since 1970. I have some beliefs, and my belief is that we are basically pretty good. I think we are born with stuff in us that can be problematic, and that we depend on good enculturation to bring under control. I'm not, you can see in the behavior of toddlers that they're not angels. But the way they are is, what evolution has sort of determined that we ought to be at that age. I'm sort of assuming that. How could it be otherwise? And maybe at the beginning of life, we need to have enough egotism or egoism that we'll be able to, in a sense, represent our own interests in a world that, where there are some competing interests. I don't know if I'd ever thought of this before, actually, but I think that evolutionarily, we're born to establish that we're going to be for ourselves. There's a famous rabbi who said something like, if I'm not for myself, who will be, or something like that. But anyway, that there is something important about, representing oneself. But that evolution also could expect that that the little one growing up is going to get enculturated into a system of where it'll internalize certain controls. So we might be really good in terms of how evolution intends for us to be. But in any event, what I do claim to show is that the stepping onto the path of civilization unleashes a force that's going to give some of the worst of our potentialities a disproportionate part of the picture, so that we've got Putin making Europe terrible. Well, I mean, greatly troubled, and the fascists of Gaza, of Hamas, joining with the fascist government in Israel to introduce such a force of brokenness that it, for one thing, it even kind of threatens to help Donald Trump become president. I mean, a lot of young people, and not just Arabs in Michigan, are not happy with Biden. And I understand that. I actually think that Biden started off great, but then he made a serious blunder by not separating himself very openly and more widely and sooner from Netanyahu and his government. And I think he would have had the approval of the Arabs of Michigan. I think it's one of Biden's weaknesses. No kind of vice. I mean, Biden wanted all the right stuff. He's just not good at hardball when he needs to be. Which is why a lot of people got to step up now and speak in whatever ways that are available to them to whatever parts of the American electorate are available to them. We've got to step up and speak because we're in a situation where it looks pretty inevitable that the standard bearer of everything that's good in America is going to be Joe Biden. I mean, people talk about alternative scenarios, and I've been one of those who had talked about it. And I'm confused about what would be ideal from here to there. But I think we're going to have Biden, and I think Biden would do a fine job. But he's not equipped to lead the messaging that is required in this campaign. And by campaign, I mean all the dimensions of a campaign to save American democracy that have to do with messaging. For one thing, I've had the idea just this morning that Biden really should communicate with the American people through recorded messages. He's such a mediocre speaker that multiple takes, properly edited. I mean, he's a man with a wonderful heart. And when he says democracy's on the ballot, he means it. But if he's speaking live in front of the news cameras, he doesn't get very good wood on the ball. So we need a lot of people to be asking themselves, what can I do with an election that we need to win, in which our champion is going to be Joe Biden, who's not going to be able to do what FDR would have done on the stump or in messaging of any kind. We need people to step up and wage the campaign in a broader way. We don't have the guy at the bully pulpit using it the way it could be used. But we have other ways of dramatizing what's important for the American people to know. I heard a rather good idea the other day on TV. I was watching Tony Schwartz being interviewed. Tony Schwartz is the guy who actually wrote Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, and he's been apologizing for some years now with his role in helping this monster climb. I think he sees his book as having gotten Trump the apprentice, and his getting to be the celebrity he was on The Apprentice as something that he could translate into, well, first being the most prominent birther, and then actually becoming a real contender for the presidency. So Tony Schwartz, who's been apologizing for what he did, has also lately been expressing his genuine fear. And I kind of wonder, I wouldn't have thought this, but when I say fascism, we know that part of the picture of fascism is sometimes jackboots at the door. That's how it was in Stalin's Soviet Union. And by the way, I know that fascism is usually seen as the totalitarianism on the right, and communism was a totalitarianism on the left, and okay, the ownership of the means of production. But I think basically what the Gestapo did and what Stalin's secret police did are the same thing. We need to step up and have many voices speaking in many ways. And what Tony Schwartz said, besides he's afraid and will leave the country if Trump wins because he's to be afraid for his life. I don't know. That we should, he called for 4 generals to take it upon themselves to devise the most effective ways they can of delivering a collective message to the country. Because there are a lot of people, particularly on the side of things that tend to vote for Republicans, a pro-military mindset, which is different from the mindset that readily fits in with a liberal and democratic point of view. I remember when I was a candidate for Congress in Virginia's 6th District, VMI is part of the district in Lexington, Virginia. And I went to visit there. I kind of loved the way those cadets were so polite, and they're all so disciplined. But I could also feel that there was a conservative bent that's built into a military structure, which is why the region of the Confederacy has always been the more militarized region of the country. It's a matter of values and of character structure. And in any event, Schwartz is right that conservatives are responsive to military values. And they're respectful of people of high military rank in general. In general. It's an admiral quality, too. So he gave 4 generals, and I can only remember 3. I'm sorry, but the first there's Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis. What was his first name? Jim or something? He was Trump chose him to be his Secretary of Defense, and he eventually resigned over a disagreement of principles. So he's a general. He's well respected. John Kelly was a general who became chief of staff to Trump, and he's willing to say some really strong things about Trump. I know that he has said that Trump is the most damaged human being he has ever seen. And I don't know what all he would be willing to say. And then there's General Milley, who is the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Trump evidently has a thing for, because he wasn't willing to do Trump's bidding and break the law here and there. I don't know I can't remember if it was like using gunfire to clear this Lafayette Square, or if it's got to do with, evoking the Insurrection Act, but anyway, Trump's been gunning for Milley, and Milley actually played a role while the rule of law was under significant threat from Trump leading up to January 6th or on January 6th. I can't remember what it was. Milley actually took some steps, I think, on January 6th in terms of communication that bypassed aspects of the chain of command. I think what was there is that he perceived that Trump was trying to do something illegal, and he chose to go outside the chain of command to protect American democracy. And then there would be a 4th general. And I kind of like that idea. Okay, we don't have, Biden just doesn't have what it takes in this age of public relations. Lincoln, I guess, had a high squeaky voice or something like that. I don't know about squeaky, but I don't think Hollywood would have cast that particular lanky, clumsy guy. But he had a way with the written word. Those generals can get in front of the American people by creating events that would get attention, whether it's buying advertising time or holding some kind of event that will be covered by the national media, or whatever would be the most impactful. The way Schwartz is thinking for them, I'd like everybody to be thinking in terms of what can they do. Now, I describe myself as a man on a mission. And I said that for some years, I thought that I had my core mission had to do with American democracy, because starting at least in 2004, I was very disturbed by what I saw rising on the right. And I pursued that mission in a variety of ways. I had a website that had 2,000 or 3,000 visitors a day. I'm trying to say, hey, basically, this is not politics as usual. In fact, what we're dealing with here is fascism, and also tying that into there are ways of understanding this. The most meaningful way of understanding the nature of the political battle in America right now, I was trying to say, is as a battle between two coherent forces that it's reasonable to call good and evil. So I had a mission, and I got some things attended to. I ran for Congress and delivered a speech, the one you can find by Googling Schmuckler and Labor Day, which was my attempt. It was a culmination of 2-year attempt here in Virginia's 6th District to say, we're not running against something that's politics as usual. We're running against a very, what was the phrase, dark and sick spirit that's insatiable in its lust for power and wealth. I didn't use the word fascism, but that phraseology basically describes a lot about what fascism is. I think that Putin is the wealthiest man in the world. I've heard that he has his kleptocracy arrangements with the oligarchs have given him something like $200 billion. And he's not satisfied to be the one-man ruler of Russia. He's got to have more power. He's got to invade his neighbor and rebuild the Soviet Union so he can stand toe-to-toe with the United States, and meanwhile support Donald Trump, who will weaken the United States. And maybe Putin can win the Cold War that the Soviet Union seemed for a while to have lost. Well, everybody can see it now. I don't think that I can assume that everybody sees just how dark this thing is. And I like thinking strategically about, well, what would I do if I were da-da-da-da-da? Because we got to win this battle. And it's essentially even to winning the much larger war of, like, will human civilization survive? If fascism takes over what had been the leader of the free world, the survival prospects of human civilization will take a significant hit. We won't deal with climate change very well. We won't deal with creating a better international order very well. Fascism does not build things, it destroys them. And that's what's happening in the Middle East, too. And that's what's happening here in the United States, including having the same party that supports this fascistic leader is also allowing itself in the House of Representatives to be controlled by its fascistic extreme, to the point where if Ukraine aid were brought to the floor of the House, it would pass. All kinds of things could pass. But Trump and his fascistic allies in the House that are calling the shots won't let it come to the floor. Mike Johnson is either with them or controlled by them. That's the force of fascism, helping the fascist dictator in Russia, when snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. I mean, the Ukrainians lacking what America should be willingly giving in abundance, because it is a huge bargain for us and for NATO. We get so much bang for our national security buck for everything that we give to the Ukrainians. Nonetheless, but because of this fascistic power, like the Supreme Court that just helped fascism by delaying the trial, this fascistic wing of the Republican Party is helping the fascistic leader of Russia, who was on the ropes. Now, maybe that's a little too strong. That counteroffensive last summer was disappointing. But even with that, even if there's a stalemate, Putin, the main fascist figure in the world, say, before this invasion, he was the champion of fascism on the planet, I would say, more than Xi, because he was involving himself in helping fascist parties across Europe, etc., and helping Trump. And being kind of aggressive in seizing Crimea, etc. This fascist leader is being helped by the fascistic element in the United States. So you can sort of see a global struggle. And you can see that a small piece of the picture is having a disproportionate role in making the human world ugly. Letting Putin off the ropes is contributing to the ugliness of our future. Every advance of fascism in the world, maybe I'm overgeneralizing. It's not like I've mapped out 50 possibilities here with fascism, but everything that I can see here is making it more likely that the human world will be one in which the force of brokenness continues to endanger the viability of this experiment of civilization that life is conducting on Earth. That is a multidimensional thing, which I think helps us fight each fight. For one thing, when you understand that you basically can meaningfully look at this as two coherent forces that you could meaningfully call good and evil, you get access to a lot of power that's sort of built into us. Human beings can be very motivated when they have a moral conviction, and when they are in contact with important spiritual truth, they are much more powerful in the arena of action. Seeing things in the big picture. I mean, we've always understood that the big picture is where you see the meaning of things. And the meaning of things is that we're up against that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be, and that we are up against a social evolutionary destructive force that was an inevitable consequence of our taking this unprecedented step onto the path of civilization. It's unprecedented. It inevitably generates a selective process in which what can prevail in a war of all against all, the way of this gangster, is going to have a disproportionate say. So we know that this ugliness, this spirit of the gangster that's making Europe and the Middle East and America much uglier than some sense of what the whole is, we know that we are better than that. Whenever you hear people say, well, that's human nature. Pay attention when you hear people say that. That's human nature. They're always pointing to some of our defects. But any creature that stepped across that, out of the natural order and into this new kind of disorder would have the spirit of the gangster having a disproportionate role in shaping the human world. We know that we are better creatures than that this ugliness is not ours. We can play a better role in choosing our destiny. If we imagine that, people are always going to be like this, what kind of world can we imagine? Nothing that greatly improves its viability. We're always going to have people will always say, and ... and it's usually something ugly. Well, if we could bring the forces that I claim that I can show from an evolutionary perspective inevitably emerge, if we could bring those under control, that would help us in our, if we understand that's what we're up against, and that's the name of that book, we're going to do a lot better fighting against it. If we can understand that we're really better creatures than that, we'll imagine ourselves to be capable of creating a much better world than this, which I think we are. And one way of looking at that is that what I claim I prove in that book, that the only reason that this force that selects for some things that are ugly, like gangster spirit, all you need to posit about the creature is that it have an unprecedented creative intelligence. It's we as a species, and I'm talking about these others that I'm just imagining are out there because there's so many planets, all evolve in a process where who can get their DNA into the future is the name of the game, and it creates biological systems from the cell to the organism to the species to the ecosystem to the biosphere. All these things are getting created over, well, in our case, I think they're up to 3.6 billion years. They think they've established that there's been life. That's a very long time. And then you have one creature that starts to invent its own way of life. Other creatures have got aspects of culture that are in them. But the difference with human beings has been such that we actually, at a certain point, began to transform the whole nature of the society. It was no longer, as with hunting-gathering societies, they were basically continuous with the primitive, with the primate societies out of which we emerged. There was nothing really that was a point of big discontinuity in the history of life from the biological natural selection process. And then comes a species that has a capability that no other creature has ever had. We can start changing the rules of the game. We start planting seeds instead of just gathering things. We start herding animals instead of hunting them. And within 5,000 years, what you've got are, societies that are nothing like what we evolved in. And I say, what you've got after 5,000 years is what's been able to survive in a war of all against all. That's what the inevitable consequence of what the evolutionary perspective says. You've left the natural order where things are well regulated, and you've plunged into anarchy, and this is the consequence. We're kind of a tragic hero as a species. The tragic hero is repeatedly in the Greeks and I think also in the Elizabethans. Somebody who is, I think Aristotle writes about this in his Poetics, that the tragic flaw in the hero. I think he writes about this. Maybe I wrote about it in my undergraduate dissertation on heroic tragedy. His tragic flaw is, in a sense, the other side of the coin from what it is that makes him great. And we human beings, we're the creatures that, however far back you want to go, 700,000 years ago, when we bring fire under control, or later tool making, language, paintings, all kinds of things that we adopted culture as a major strategy for survival. And that, okay, and we're trucking along, still continuous with the system of life as hunter gatherers, but we've got culture. But then, because we've as cultural animals, we've invested more and more in the brain. We've become more and more intelligent, bigger brained, and then we get to the point where, and there's some dispute about, well, why did people step across that threshold onto the path of civilization? There's a book called Food Crisis in Prehistory by a guy named Cohen from Yale, 1975, where he makes a case that that step onto the path of civilization was actually necessitated. It was like necessity is the mother of invention, having to do with territory being scarce in some way. I haven't kept up with that literature, but I have a chapter in that book laying out that hypothesis. So maybe people didn't even feel like they were free to continue as they were, or maybe they were just saying, "Hey, I got a great idea. Let's step onto this path of getting greater control over our world than we did when we evolved into being creatures like us." But in any event, we took that step. And we were able to take that step only because we're the most creative and intelligent species Earth has yet seen. It's a tragedy, in a sense, that our great strength, this neocortex of ours, equips us to unleash forces that we can't control. Suddenly I think about all those mythologies about when people unleash forces that they can't control. In Fantasia, there's these mops that Mickey Mouse has somehow unleashed because he fell asleep. That's flooding the world. It's a good metaphor in a way for what we unleashed in stepping across that threshold. And it's not because we fell asleep. We were just doing what our cleverness allowed us to do for our survival. Growing gardens, herding reindeer, whatever the deal was, goats or sheep. It's really kind of a marvelous thing, which eventually leads to a lot of marvelous things like Bach's music and the James Webb Telescope and the works of Shakespeare and technology like this, all that. But even while people are doing what they can to create meaning and meet human needs and all that, there's still this main headwind of selection for the ways of power. And this is what where I encourage anybody who wants to know if all this holds water to take a look on a betterhumanstory.org, where in as concisely as I can, I make what I think is a watertight argument showing that it is inevitable that once a species takes that step, it is inevitable that there will emerge a selective process. Only those cultural options that can survive in a world, a disordered world where there's a war of all against all. Only those cultural options can survive and spread, while the rest of the cultural options, many of which might be more beautiful than what is good on the battlefield get eliminated by the war of all against all. I think it is simply inescapable. And I think that we'd be more likely to survive for the long haul. First of all, if we understand that we are not all this ugliness, that we deserve to be believed in, we deserve to believe in our capabilities way more than we think, or at least more than we think. I don't know how much more. And if we understand the ways in which a force of brokenness emerged in the world and inevitably continue to ramify through the world, and I lay all that out, and that we're dependent upon some life-serving things that evolved within us. And we know that they're life-serving because otherwise they wouldn't have been selected for. All right, the ancestors that had them wouldn't have done better than the ancestors that didn't. So they were at least were life-serving, that people experienced the better and the worse in the way that they did, which gives rise to the moral dimension. And that people were capable of having spiritually transformative experiences. If we can understand the nature of the battle that we're engaged in, and that we are not congenitally nearly so aligned with brokenness as we have thought, and that we are entitled to take with absolute seriousness and to fully honor the moral dimension and the spiritual dimension, which liberal America, I would say, has not, which has interfered with its ability to see what was rising on the right. You can't see what you don't have a conceptual space for. And evil was rising on the right with Limbaugh and with Gingrich and Fox News. If you look at really what's going into them and what they're working toward, a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world more broken. I think that that's an entirely legitimate definition of a reality that it's entirely reasonable to call evil. But if you don't have a conceptual space for it, like in baseball, you can't hit what you can't see. Democrats were thinking, oh, this is politics as usual for years and years after it seemed to become crystal clear. These are not your friends across the aisle, however they may be in human terms. In terms of the force that they are fighting you with on the behalf of, they are allied with a force of brokenness, and they need to be fought and defeated. In climate change, on the rule of law, on the survival of the will of the people as a determinant of how power will be used, on a whole list, on the relationship between the races. The other side is getting consistently on the wrong place, always on the side that should not win the battle. That shows a coherence there, the consistency of how they are on every issue you put on the list, always making things worse. That tells you something, and I want to offer my Better Human story as a way of understanding all of these forces at work and all of these dimensions of reality that are real, important, and life-serving in a way that is consistent with the epistemology of the secular worldview. I was brought up not to accept things on the basis of what does authority say. I'm not, I don't look to God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. No, I was brought up by my dad, who is a child of the Enlightenment, as he described himself, to say we got to look at the evidence. We got to find the facts. And then we got to draw the conclusions that are reasonable to draw. And that's what I've been doing for over half a century. And I think it sticks. And if you would want to know whether I do make it stick, I hope that you will check it out. Now, it's true that to claim that this might have a beneficial impact on the human future might seem far-fetched. And if I didn't believe it, by the way, my whole life would have been different, but I do believe it. But I also am willing to examine it. Ideas are limited in their ability to impact the world, but they do have impact. I mean, it must be a object lesson to consider what's happened to the teachings of Jesus. I have written a lot of op-eds to this piece of Christendom that I live in here, because I've witnessed how people who, on my radio shows out here in the 1990s, were so eloquent and entirely credible when they talked about their Christian values. And not only when they talked about them, but they also described how they lived by them in some ways that I found impressive. There's a beauty to a teaching that talks about doing unto others as you would have others do unto you. I mean, if you want a better human world, which I do passionately, the more you could get people to follow the golden rule, wouldn't that be wonderful? And even more so, to love thy neighbor as thyself. I mean, that's asking a lot. I do okay with the golden rule, I think, but loving people, that's I'm a little more distinguished. But I think it's beautiful. I think anybody who can live according to that is really going to help heal the world. I mean, everybody, I think, is healed by the kind of love that Jesus was teaching, and everything that heals anybody in any way is all for the better for how the world is going to develop. And there are lots of other things like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, beautiful teachings. And so I think I wrote a long time ago. I imagined that somebody came to Jesus and before he was crucified and said, "Well, don't worry, your teachings are going to be written down. They're going to be read by millions of people. It's going to be the book. A lot of people are going to consider it the inerrant word of God. They're going to talk about your words every Sunday. And it's going to be the dominant religion in the most powerful nexus of civilization, Europe, Christendom, on the planet. If I were to hear that my teachings would get that kind of play, I would think, oh, wow, boy, I can imagine what the world's going to look like. The history of Christendom. The history of Christendom has got as much ugliness in it as pretty much any other history of the world. You've got churches aligning themselves during Hitler's reign of power with a regime that ran death camps for 6 million people just because they were of a particular ethnic / religious background. Yeah, the ability to perpetuate a spirit of wholeness is, well, people try. I think of Dostoevsky's chapter that one of his characters in the Brothers Karamazov writes a chapter called The Grand Inquisitor. and Jesus comes back, and he's in jail, and he's going to be burned at the stake as a heretic, I guess. And he's visited by the Grand Inquisitor, who knows who he is. And the whole thing is the Grand Inquisitor speaking to Jesus. Jesus never says a word. Well, the guy who is sort of representing Jesus' power on earth, the Grand Inquisitor, is really, in a way, the opposite of Jesus' teachings. And he explains why, and it's got to do with the limitations of human beings, if I'm not mistaken. We come back to, yeah, it's all our fault. It's a blame the victim thing. But anyway, I think it's Ivan that writes this thing, and humans are just sheep, and they need this thing. And yeah, it's probably right that the Russians, in some ways, have been turned into sheep, but that is not human nature at large. So anyway, how much control? How much can even the most wonderful of ideas shape the world? But my ambition, I'm not pretending that my ideas are supposed to be treated as like the new a book in the New Testament or something like that. No, I'm just saying that there's no guarantee about what happens when an idea goes out into the world, but we can see that there are ideas that have gone out into the world that do affect how people think about things. I mean, we're thinking about, say, the ramifications of climate change, and also how to control a pandemic. The Darwinian framework, if we didn't have any sense of evolution at all, we would be greatly handicapped in terms of how we're going to navigate ourselves in this world where, like a virus, a deadly virus might arise, or in which the Earth's climate system is being destabilized and endangering whether species will be able to adapt and survive, or whether there's going to be that sixth big wave of extinctions. There are ideas that prove useful and powerful, and I think that if what I've spent my life developing were to get out there, as well as a couple ideas that I, systems of thinking that I saw operating in the world that I got educated in. I think that it might have a sufficient clarifying effect, in sufficiently widespread, at least, that people might make some better choices. It sure would have been better if people 20 years ago had seen that it was time for the liberal America to rise and fight against the force of fascism. Instead, we had almost close to more than half of 20 years in which it stayed true what Yeats said about the good lack all conviction, while the evil are filled with a passionate intensity. So it can make a difference whether you can see what the battle is and how the battlefield is shaped. And if enough people, and I don't know what enough people is, I know that this is not it, because when that book came out and made something of a splash with a full-page review in the New York Times, I thought, oh boy, this thing blew me away. It's going to blow a lot of people away. And everything that I've been envisioning during my 14 years of struggle in the wilderness, getting my doctorate for doing something very unorthodox. It's gonna have the impact on how we see the challenge that we face, and we'll be better able to meet it. But as I've indicated previously, whereas I grew up with some assumptions about how things worked. Like you put that out, it holds water. No, people say it's compelling, and nobody finds a hole in it. Nobody refutes it in any way. Nobody even lays a glove on it. It's just sitting there, saying that putting our nature, our history, and the nature of the challenge we face in an importantly different light, which has big ramifications if it were true. So you got to refute it or accept it or at least struggle with it. I thought that was the case, but instead it just disappeared. Mostly, I mean, there are people around the world who actually wouldn't disagree with things that I'm claiming, having read that book and maybe followed the ways in which I've developed it since. But it's really, I'm not bragging when I say that, and I'm not going to deny that I've been a very marginal and, for the most part, insignificant figure, despite my attempts to hit the ball over the fence. But when I was getting educated, there were a couple of ideas that got out there enough to affect the thinking of the society at large. Not everybody, but enough people that people were ready to look at things in Freudian terms or in Marxian terms. Those are the two guys. Sometimes in ways that illuminated things nicely. I think both of those guys had some important points to make. Enough to affect, how the movies represented the human world, and therefore, it was part of the culture. I don't know that there's any reasonable way that I might aspire to be any more, to get my better human story out there as a perspective through which to see the human world any more fully than Freud or Marx. I would be happy to have a competition with either of those guys, but I can't think of anybody in history that's ever, really, something just came to me that back in the late Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, people talked about Aristotle, who had just recently been recovered by Western civilization through the Arab world, actually. Aristotle got called the philosopher. Even with the chutzpah that I make these claims, anybody called me the philosopher. I don't like that. It's not right. I illuminate a few things that I think are important, but there's a lot going on. And we need a lot of people showing what's going on. I just, not this week. This week's thing is about our profound problem with the Supreme Court we have now. My weekly op-ed in a week's time, unless something happens to change my mind, is going to be about the new technologies of how algorithms are working online and the whole prospect of AI. These are things that I do not understand. I'm an old man. I understand the dynamics of the world that I grew up in, enough to be able to talk about the danger of nuclear holocaust and the danger of environmental destruction. But when we talk about the force of the algorithms and the potential consequences of the full development of AI, I'm in a world that I'm a stranger in a strange land, to go back to grokking. I don't grok that. But I have a friend who has been in that world for a long time, and he's brilliant. He teaches in an area that's called cybernetics. He got his degree from MIT. And anyway, he's concerned about how these technologies and the technologies in general, this age, that we've plunged into. So I called him and asked him, please educate me. how is it that algorithms work as a force that shape the human world? And, is there a danger that AI will prove to be a force that operates contrary to the kind of civilization human beings would want? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that I've been asking, but I don't have a handle on these things. And anyway, I've written about this because I can convey what he explained to me, and there are some things to be said that maybe that I kind of understand, but I'm out of my depth. So what I claim is that I can show that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. That any creature on any planet, ... stepping onto the path of civilization inevitably would condemn them to be swept up in a social evolutionary force as destructive and painful as the one we've been on. That there would inevitably emerge out of that selective process in that social evolutionary force a destructive force that you can see how it operates in the dense network of cause and effect, such that you can see that a force emerges that spreads a pattern of brokenness through the human world over time, indefinitely. A pattern of brokenness that's got to do with how war creates trauma, creates people who are inclined to create more war, and all kinds of feedback loops in the network of cause and effect that make brokenness beget brokenness. And it can be shown, and it emerges inevitably in a social evolutionary process in which the dynamic is that these civilizing and civilized societies are going to be in a disorder which mandates a war of all against all, that says that the spirit of the gangster is going to get a disproportionate say in shaping that future. And that destructive force actually is a coherent force. It acts very much like Western civilization used to think of evil. Wow, evil. I've dealt with liberals about the word evil ever since I published a piece in 2005 called "The Concept of Evil: Why It Is Intellectually Valid and Politically and Spiritually Important." And you can Google that title if you want to see it. 2005. I'm already talking about evil, and I was embarked in a major study, and I think I can show in several different ways that there is something that can be described as a coherent force that consistently makes the human world worse. And I propose that if you have something like that, which, as I say, I can describe it in several different ways, that it is reasonable to call that a definition of evil. And then beyond that, to clarify the nature of the forces that we need to bring under control, to draw as fully as we can on some life-affirming forces that have been built into us by the evolutionary process that continually favors what can put its DNA into the future over what cannot. And you end up with a battle that we're really called to fight, because it is a toss-up whether human civilization is going to get its act together, which is the force of wholeness, such that we can survive on the long haul and be okay for life on Earth, or whether we're going to destroy ourselves, or at least inflict on ourselves some self-inflicted catastrophe. So we've got really something going on at the heart of the human drama, which is really the essential challenge that we face, is to make sure that good defeats evil. Lots of ways of talking about in terms of names. I like that name. I like it because those words have a deep cultural resonance, which corresponds to something that I think is deep in us. Now, we can deny the reality of forces that are worth calling good and evil. But you can't deny that the blockbuster movies demonstrate that this is a very rich force of current within us. Anyone who goes through the original Star Wars trilogy and gets excited and drawn up into the action by Luke's attempt to destroy the Death Star at the end of the third one, with the one with the Ewoks, we have our passions drawn in and we get the gratification of its blowing apart. That's how we need to feel when the destruction of everything we hold sacred is in fact in danger in this battle. That's who evidently we are. We are creatures who are ready to go to battle against evil. If the thing is seen in those terms, if it's experienced that way, if the Emperor's creepiness and Jabba the Hutt and Darth Vader and all that stuff, and the beauty of Luke, see the Force, and Yoda, and the innocence, and the beauty of Princess Leia, all that stuff making us, and the Ewoks and their National Geographic life-oriented ways. We're all ready to be passionate in favor of, and that's what we need to be. We can bring that kind of passion to showing he's guilty, which is where we started this discourse today. Trump is guilty. That message is one of the weapons in this battle, and we need to fight it with the same passions that get aroused in us, not only in the Star Wars movies, but Avatar. I mean, the beauty of those creatures on that planet where that's getting destroyed by the military-industrial complex that's in its greed and destructiveness is willing to do anything to the sacred forest in order to obtain unobtainium. I love that name for the thing that they're looking for, the enriching mineral they're willing to destroy the planet for. We get drawn up into what's sacred, the coming together of our hero and the blue lady in love and sacredness, blessed by those little dandelion flowers that are signaling the sacredness. That is something that was within us to respond to. And I say it can be shown in an evolutionary perspective that this is exactly what the life force would want for us to do. This is exactly what is whole would want for us to do. That the force of the good is to be tapped into with passion. No more the good lack all conviction. That passionate intensity is part of what life calls forth from us. We don't want Putin to succeed in conquering Ukraine and then maybe bringing about World War III if he makes good his threat to attack NATO. We don't want the Middle East to become a place where hatreds have been intensified and the possibilities of any kind of just and lasting peace have been virtually eliminated, et cetera, et cetera. We want the rule of law and not the tyranny that's insatiable in its lust for wealth and power. I'm a man on a mission. Those of us who really are attached to what's good and right and sacred, we all should be on a mission. There is a showdown coming. We must win it. Thank you. Please subscribe if any of this makes you think I'm worth following. Please go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, where a whole lot of things are laid out. And if you're interested in more of the kind of integrative vision that I've been trying to improvise in this video, that can be found in lots of other videos on my YouTube channel, Something Rather Better Human Story. I'm not really master of this terrain, but I've put a lot of stuff out there. If you want to see more, please do. And I will be back. I don't know if I'll be back real soon. My voice could use a rest. One of the medical mishaps in my life is that something that was supposed to make things better made things worse about 11 years ago. I've come to terms with it, but still it can get painful. If you'll help me get this better human story into your mind and into the minds of anybody else you think might help advance it, if you think it does put things in an importantly different light, and if you think that that importantly different light could have a beneficial impact, even if a limited one, if it's a toss-up which way it'll go, even a limited impact is worth fighting for. We are engaged in an enormous struggle, and everything of value, both at the level of American democracy and at the level of the survival of human civilization. Everything of importance is at stake. Bye-bye.